Make your way to the front, and we'll hear some. We'll take some this way, back and forth. Andy, you want to share this mic? Okay.
Well, the first, you're standing on a question. Is there hope for Dawkins? Well, suppose you'd ask the question, is there hope for Saul of Tarsus? Is there hope for you? Dawkins, in that sense, is not special. He's like the rest of us. And if it weren't for the grace of God, there would have been no hope for me. You will notice, if you watch my debates, I try to befriend these people. There's no antagonism. I trust. Because that's the way the Lord treated me. And that's the way we're called upon to treat people. We've got to respect them. My parents taught me the basic principle that governed their lives was all men and women are created equal in the eyes of God, made in the image of God, whether they believe in God or not. And I must show that attitude to them.
This is great. Never played poker with an Irishman, is all I can say.
I'm just filtering out the science ones, actually. Yeah. So they're all for you. Okay, take any of those. I'll spread a few out. Let me sort while you talk.
Oh, wonderful. Fantastic. So, this question here says, Christians use morality as proof of the existence of God, but how do we refute atheist arguments that morality is an evolved state of mind for the preservation of society? Great question. Do you know, I get that question on university campuses all the time, often from atheist students who will kind of bounce up to me after a lecture and say something like, you know, the problem with you Christians, I always love questions that begin that way, is that you guys believe that you know, atheists can't be good people. And I think if that's the understanding, or if that's the way that Christians are communicating, we are making a mistake. Because the argument is not that atheists can't be good without God. The argument is that without God there is no such thing as goodness. And you see, here's the problem. Whether you try and get your morality from science, whether you try and get your morality from evolution, whether you try and get your morality from wherever, if there is no God, everything really ultimately comes down to personal preference. And evolution may have privileged some preferences over another, but ultimately that is all that remains. They are just preferences. You see, the idea that we can derive morality from evolution, what it basically says is that over the millennia, we have basically evolved the idea that not bashing other people over the head and stealing their spectacles is a kind of good thing. I quite like John's spectacles; it gives him an academic look. Well, thank you. We should often try those out. But all really evolution has done, if evolution is the only game in town, is it's given us some instincts and some urges. And here's the problem. Sometimes I have the urge to behave nicely to my friend standing next to me. Sometimes I have the urge to bash him over the head and steal his spectacles. Sometimes I have the urge to behave one way, sometimes I have the urge to behave another. What on earth makes some of our urges and instincts moral and others of them just urges and just natural reflexes? And the problem we have is that morality and goodness and value judgments bubble up. A bit like bubbles under the wallpaper. You know, if you've ever put wallpaper on a wall and you have a bubble somewhere, you push it down here and it pops up here. You really can't get away from it. And you really are forced to the conclusion that if there is no God, then maybe we've sort of told ourselves a few noble myths about how to survive as descended life forms. But actually there's nothing better than that. But I put it to you, and I put it to my atheist friends, when you look around the world right now, when you look at ISIS, when you look at Ukraine, when you look at Sudan, when you look at Somalia, when you look at some of the worst places in the world, we need something a darn sight more than just the internal urge or just personal preferences. If there is no such thing as justice, if there is no such thing as goodness, my world, the world, is in trouble. And Christianity says not merely is there a God who is good, who is the foundation of all justice and all nobility and all truth, but that God has not merely told us about right and wrong, told us about goodness and told us about morality, but has stepped into the world in the person of Jesus and done something about the problem.
Dostoevsky once said on this, Yeah, I see. We've endless lines of people. I was just going to say, make an added comment to that. That in Russia, Dostoevsky is regarded very highly, especially when he says in The Brothers Karamazov, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. He didn't mean, of course, that atheists can't behave. Atheists or atheist friends can put us to shame because they're, just like we are, moral beings made in the image of God, and we can mess up worse than they can. But what he meant was there's no rational base for morality if you don't believe in God. And that was one of the huge strengths of Nietzsche as opposed to the contemporary new atheists. I often refer to the contemporary new atheists as soft atheists who are hoping to retain the values of a Western liberal democracy and get rid of God. Nietzsche says that's impossible. If you get rid of God, you will in the end get rid of all values. And you cannot take or steal the values from Christianity and reject God. And of course we're seeing that in our society. So the whole moral thing is very important. And if you want a bit of my take on it, the book Gunning for God deals with to quite a large extent. I've tried to answer questions. Do you want to take some questions from?
Sure, let's take one from the microphone right there.
Thank you.
And try to keep your question to a question and not a speech, which we sometimes do. Thank you.
In keeping with the idea of the role of apologeticists as being to remove blockages, how do you answer the blockage? I don't want to look at the possibility that God might exist because I'm fine without God. I don't need God.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I say to people, you're fine now, you think. Aren't you interested in the truth about your situation? Or are you content to imprison yourself in a very strongly walled prison? What happens when you get cancer, for instance? I discover that people take this closed view. When the fineness of their life disappears, they get into trouble, it becomes very different. And I try to talk to them about the question of knowing truth. You see, if they profess to be thinking people, they often get embarrassed by that and they respond to it. So that would be my first approach. But the difficulty with this question is that it's person-specific. And you know, giving a generalized answer is utterly impossible. One size fits all, it doesn't work. I want to, long before I get to that point, I want to listen to that person. See where they're hurting. See why it is. They may be even frightened of God and so on. So my method of procedure is a little bit unusual. When I meet somebody new, especially in that situation, I keep asking them questions until they ask me one. Try it. It'll make a difference to your life. But Andy wants to come in on this as well.
Oh, well, I can. Yeah. Great. That's a great question. What's your name, by the way? Rosalind. I mean, I think it's a phenomenal question. One of the interesting things is that RZAM, the organisation that I work for here at the John, is associated with, when Ravi Zacharias set up RZAM, actually launched it here in Canada 30 years ago, one of the founding principles was that he wanted to reach what he described as the quote-unquote the happy pagan. He thought that many organisations, many Christians were very good at reaching people who were kind of in crisis, but actually what do you do with people who feel quite happy about their life? I think John's answer was brilliant. The one thing I would add is that ask great questions, but also learn to listen. One of my favourite poets is the English poet Rudyard Kipling. And he once wrote a very interesting poem. He was actually describing smuggling, which was something that went on about 300 years ago in England, basically to avoid kind of tax that was levied on...
Still goes on today.
Yeah, still goes on today. Thank you, John. In Ireland, obviously. I think we know how you guys are. Yeah, let's not go there. That'd be like to go there. Anyway, he wrote this little poem where he said that the way that smuggling went on sort of 300 or so years ago in England was that basically in villages on the coast where goods like tobacco and things were brought in, what everyone in the village knew was that when late at night you heard the sounds of kind of action out in the streets, like horses and carts and things, you knew that you turned the other way and didn't ask questions. And he wrote a poem about this, at the heart of which was this little line, "Watch the wall, my darling, while the smuggling men go by." An idea, when you hear those voices, when you hear those things smuggled past, say nothing. Why do I give that illustration from Kipling? Because I think many of our happy pagan friends are smuggling values from the Christian worldview. John's already talked about some this evening. The idea that we can think, the idea that we can have goodness, the idea that there is beauty, the idea that there is meaning and purpose. And it's very interesting when you hear somebody who says, oh, I don't need God, and then as you ask a few little questions on, you suddenly discover that they give large amounts of money to Amnesty International, or have a Save the Whales sticker on the back of their car, or that kind of thing. And a very good question, John talked about asking questions, is to smile gently and look them in the eye and go, precisely what worldview are you smuggling those things from? Because you say you don't need God, but you seem to be borrowing quite heavily from the things, if he does not exist, do not exist either. You really can't have your cake and eat it. And I think when we see value judgments smuggled, we can ask the question, where are they coming from? Because it's one thing to say you don't need God, it's another thing to be willing to throw out everything that is traditionally founded upon him. But do that graciously, not through trying to sort of score points as you ask the question.
We're going to go to this lady next, and then a paper question.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to ask, when it comes to evolution, like mathematically speaking, how they calculate the age of fossils and all that, it seems to me that there are many variants, variants that have to be filled with assumptions to get to an answer. So why evolution is being told like it is definitely truth when it's just a theory, because there is no proof of it?
Okay. Shall I say something about that? There are several questions here about evolution and all this kind of thing, and the age of the earth and so on. That would actually, to attempt to deal with these important questions, would take a whole evening. Let me just say something very briefly. It's interesting that always, almost without exception in North America, a question will come up about fossils, evolution, the age of the earth, and all this kind of thing. And my first point would be that you will observe in the Christian world equally godly Christians who are utterly convinced of the fact of creation, the pre-existence of Christ, his virgin conception, his miracles, his life, his death, his resurrection, the coming of the Holy Spirit and his return. And they disagree about the interpretation of Genesis 1. That ought to make us humble, to think that the situation might be more complex than we think. And let me just teasingly, you probably want to put me in front of a firing squad when I say this, but I liked you talking about compassion earlier, so we'll see if they can exercise compassion. It's very odd to me that there is contention at all about the age of the earth. Why? Because the first two verses of Genesis 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and so on, are in a different Hebrew tense from the sequence of days. And my friends whom I've consulted, who are world experts on Hebrew, say that means that the in the beginning is detached from the days. So whatever you believe about the days, the creation, you will notice, did not occur on day one. Every one of the days begins, and God said. So from the simple text of the Bible, it seems to me that the Bible says precisely nothing about the age of the earth. Now, all the extra difficulties you raise about death and so on, I get these questions so often that I've written a book about them. So there's a shameless bit of advertising. It's a huge question. But there it comes. 7 days that divide the world is precisely geared to people who find a tension between what they're taught in science and what they're taught in church. And I've tried to write as a person who's fully convinced of the inspiration and authority of Scripture. So that will have to do on that one, because you need a conference on it, not just a single question.
Okay, thank you. Should we take that young man, and then let's do another paper question.
I love the way, Peter, that when he mentioned firing squad, you stepped away from John, just to be on the safe side.
Can you explain what it means when Mr. Galileo Galilei said mathematics is the language with which God wrote the universe. I ask you because you said 3/4 into your presentation, mathematics creates nothing.
That's a wonderful question. How old are you?
11.
How old are you?
11.
11. Jolly good. Well, you've got a great future, I think. Would you like to be a mathematician? Well, perhaps if I answer your question, you'd change your mind. Mathematics is the most compressed language we know. I'm a person who's interested in languages. I wanted to be a Latinist when I was your age because I love Latin, and then I shifted to modern languages, and then I settled for mathematics. What I meant by saying mathematics creates nothing, it creates nothing physical. I should have added that word in. Mathematics, in fact, we create it partially and we discover it partially. Often the question I get is, do you think mathematics is discovered or created? And I say, yes, it is. Because we are made in the image of God, and so we are creators. So I agree with Galileo, but it's not, I mean, I think he's absolutely right. It's the language God gave us. And what lies behind that, I'd love to spend half an hour expounding, because you see, it's the fact that we can describe the universe in language with meaning that is a powerful pointer to the fact that there's a logos behind the universe. If you go down the atheist route, how do you account for the idea that mathematics thought up in here can somehow describe what's out there? But the mathematics you're creating or discovering doesn't itself create anything physical, but it does a very powerful job of describing the physical movements and also enable you to predict, for example, the eclipse of the sun that's going to occur on Friday. Have you changed your mind? Okay, let's have another question.
Okay, so we're going to have Andy answer one from the paper.
Okay, so we're on to a written question now. I like the way you guys are really sending in the easy questions this evening. So here goes. This person asks, how can I address a gay family member with some kind of scriptural or apologetics approach? This person is very hostile, but was raised in a Christian home. Wow, I can almost hear the sort of, go around the room, going, okay, where's the firing? John, if you finish with that firing squad, I might need it over here. Let me answer this question, and it's a profound one, and it's one we get quite often, I think. I'd actually want to answer this question almost narratively by telling a story. In fact, I first really came across this question in a very direct form about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years ago. I was speaking at a large Canadian university. I think it was Queen's, actually, in Kingston, where I was speaking. And I'd spoken on the uniqueness of Christ. Q&A like this one. Young man comes to the microphone. Opening question. Why do you Christians hate gays? I remember thinking, thank you, Lord. I could have had an easy one, but okay, here we go. What I said to him, I think, answers this in terms of how we approach friends or family for whom sexuality is an issue they're wrestling with. First thing I did is I looked at the young man and I said, look, I have to begin by I have to be very honest with you and say, Christians don't hate gays. Absolutely, we do not. But sometimes I appreciate, by the way that the church has spoken and the way the language that Christians have used, we've given that impression. And if anyone has ever given you that impression by what they've said, thought, or by what they've said to you or treated you, I have to begin by unreservedly apologising. You could see his whole body language changed. Then I said to him, before I tell you I said, why do Christians hate gays, though? I said, do you mean, why do Christians believe what we do about homosexuality and about marriage in particular? And he went, yes, that's really my question. I said, okay, before I tell you what Christians believe, I said very quickly, I said, I'm a great believer in the proverb that goes, comparison is the mother of clarity. I said, do you know what some of the other major worldviews out there have to say about homosexuality? He said, I'm not sure what you mean. I said, well, I've spent 20 years studying Islam. My PhD is in Quranic studies. I said, do you know what Islam would say to our gay and lesbian friends? He said, I do not. I said, well, if you read the 4 schools of Sharia law, as followed by the majority of Muslims, it prescribes death for homosexuality. The only debate in Sharia law is how. by stoning or by burying alive. Those are the two most common rulings in Sharia. I said, okay, now what about atheistic naturalism? He said, I'm not sure I know what you mean. I said, well, if you're an atheist, and he said, I am. I said, okay. I said, I presume you believe that everything around us that we see in biology has to be explained by evolution. Time plus chance plus natural selection. He nodded. And I said, okay, well, there has to be an evolutionary explanation for homosexuality, does there not? And he said, well, I guess there does. I said, well, actually, if you read the literature, there are several competing explanations out there. One of the main ones that you can find in some of the journals is the idea that homosexual behaviour arises in populations of animals, including human beings, because it slows down growth rate of that population. If there's a limited amount of food or resources available, and a certain percentage of the population has same-sex attraction, the population of animals or humans or whatever will grow at a slower rate. And I said, interestingly, I can point you to an article in Huffington Post, the online newspaper, by a leading North American gay activist just a couple of months ago, making this very point and saying, we have a population explosion of human beings, we need more gays and lesbians. This from a gay activist. My atheist friend, my questioner, went, I see how that might work. I said, do you really? I said, now here's the problem, and listen to me carefully. I said, my wife and I have two good friends back in the United Kingdom who are lesbians. They are married, and they have had 2 children through artificial insemination. I said, do you now see the problem? The only reason that evolution selected for their particular sexual attraction was to put a check on population growth. They have gone out and had 2 children. They have literally subverted their very purpose. They are quite literally, on atheism, a waste of space. Now, I said the words waste of space, this kind of went around the room. And I said, here is the thing. I said, whatever Christianity has to say, whatever you think about what Christianity has to say about the issue of homosexuality, Christianity does not look at my 2 friends and say they are a waste of space. And in fact, I will take on anyone who does, because they are my friends and I love them dearly. Christianity does say that they are broken, and Christianity also says that I am broken and that each one of us are broken. And that brokenness will manifest itself in different ways until we find healing and wholeness in Jesus. But we come to him with our brokenness, not in spite of it. And that's where it begins. And that got a round of applause in an audience of 450. I'm not asking you to, half of you were skeptics. And I think we have to level the playing field when we talk about this issue and make it clear that it's not that being a homosexual somehow keeps you from Jesus, but you have to bring that to him, as we all do with our brokenness.
Excellent. Okay, what we're going to do is do one here, one there, and then we probably have to wrap it up because I see it's already 8:20, right, Mike? So the others may want to take a seat, but let's hear your question, young man.
Dr. Lennox, if you were to ask God one question, what would it be? And feel free to take a moment to think about it.
I expect to spend eternity asking him questions. Many questions. But I can never really think of one that's most important. But I think what my heart tells me is I'd want to ask the question, why did you love me? May I take one of these written questions? Is this my last?
Yeah, you can have combine the 2 if you like.
Have you one more to answer, Andy, or what?
I can do. So,
are we doing one each? I think we've only time for one each. Is that right?
And we'll also, let's take this lady first, so then she can take her seat. So go ahead, let's hear your question.
Hi. Hope this isn't one of those internal affairs questions, but how can we defend the truth in a society that is slip-sliding into amorality and increasingly intolerant of religion without lopping off the ears of our friends, family, and co-workers?
Well, in one sense, the answer to that is obvious. In another sense, it's very difficult. We have to try and live like the Lord did. And with his power and with his strength. Andy has emphasized, I've mentioned it, but let's say it again. The art of listening is not as common as it should be among Christians. We often feel we've got a message to deliver, and we do. But to sit alongside people and ask them questions until they gain enough confidence. We have a major problem in society because the very meaning of the word tolerance has changed. It used to mean I tolerate you means I disagree with you. But I'll support your right, and I hope you'll support mine, to express those disagreements politely in public. But now it means you must agree with everything I say and celebrate what I say unless you offend me. And that kind of political correctness is destroying society. There's no easy answer to that, but a general wake-up call, because that is ultimately utterly destructive of civilized discourse. And so one way I think that we can deal with things is by doing what we do tonight. We must keep God in the public square. We must keep God in the public square. And give the lie to the idea that atheism is the only position that has the right to say anything. There's no default worldview. There are worldviews. And each, in that sense, has the right to communicate its views publicly. And in a way, we've got to defend that right. But it's becoming increasingly difficult because of stealth laws, for example, that are used to apply positive discrimination. And that increases the spiral and twist. So I'm afraid there's no easy answer. But you know, what encourages me is we got more Christians around than there were when Paul first came to Europe. And the Pilgrim Fathers sailed to North America. And we need to see that the New Testament world is very like our contemporary world, pluralistic, multicultural, and all the rest of it, and pretty amoral and immoral. And yet Christianity swept the world. We must not lose our confidence in God.
Yeah. Let me add something to that connects to my last question, and then John, give you one last one. You know, it's very, very interesting to pick up on your question there. Somebody once said I think the biggest challenge in life is always to keep the main thing. And I think one of the difficulties is that as Christians, sometimes in the West, it's dreadfully easy to beat up on the church. But Christians in the West, we have sometimes allowed that which is the minor thing to become the main thing. And I think one of the ways that can sometimes happen is we can get dragged into fighting the culture wars rather than pursuing the gospel. Sometimes they align, sometimes they're not the same thing. That's one challenge. The other challenge I think we have to overcome as Christians, if we want to, for want of a better word, take back or become, greater influence in our culture. I mean, John talked about having Christianity in the marketplace of ideas. But I think sometimes as Christians we have, if we are honest, have lost our confidence, and because of that lost our voice. John and I have a good friend, a colleague of ours in Oxford University, and our colleague Michael was preaching in Pakistan a couple of years ago, and he got talking while he was there to a Pakistani pastor who, during their conversation, it was through a translator, this pastor rolled up his sleeve to reveal burn marks and cut marks on his arms, and he went on to tell the story of how he'd been arrested and tortured for his faith. He then went on to ask my friend, well, it must be, how is it for Christians in the West? It must be amazing to be able to talk freely about your faith and not live in fear. And my colleague said back through the translator, well, unfortunately, many Christians in our country are afraid. Well, what are they afraid of, said the Pakistani pastor. My colleague said, well, they're afraid of people perhaps laughing at them or thinking they're a bit peculiar. Some of you here are a bit peculiar, so you're not worried. And so because of that, they say nothing. They say nothing. Back through the translator, the Pakistani pastor replied, such a church is dying. And then the translator stopped himself and said, I'm terribly sorry, I have mistranslated him. What he actually said was, such a church is already dead. And the challenge for us as Christians, I think, here in somewhere like Canada, where we may be laughed at, we may look ridiculous, we may lose face, is to be willing to run that risk for the sake of the gospel. The last question I had, and where I'll connect this to, and then I'll hand back to my esteemed Oxford colleague, is the question I was asked, is Jesus referred in Scripture to people saying that they know him, but Jesus denies them? You know, get away from me. You know, I will say to you on that day, you never knew me, even though you said, Lord, Lord. And I think one of the challenges we have to ask ourselves, those in this room who would claim to be followers of Jesus this evening, I know this is a mixed audience, but for those who would say they are followers of Christ, is what do we really mean when we say that? Is it that we enjoy church and coming along and hanging out with fellow Christians and just playing at church? Is it fighting the culture wars? Is it feeling self-righteous and smug, if we're honest, because we are better than other people, because we have the truth? Or is it that we are willing to give up everything to follow him, because he first gave up everything for us, even if that might cost us something? Here in Canada, it won't cost us our lives, but it might cost us our reputation. It might cost us face, it might cost us a friendship or two. But when we do that, and we step out at work, on the university campuses, and out with among our friends and our families, I think God does come through. But that's a challenge that each one of us here have to ask ourselves, are we willing to pay that price? Because if the gospel hasn't cost us something, how seriously are we really committed to it?
There are about 5 questions here, but I'm going to restrict to 2 of them that relate. And they're really about, why are you a Christian? There are many religions in the world. Why would one believe that Christianity is the right one? I'm going to answer this in a way that may be slightly unfamiliar to you. In my case, one of the major reasons is because Christianity is the only thing I know that makes any sense and gives us any hope in the face of the problem of evil and pain and suffering. Now let me try and explain that very briefly, because this is a huge and very sensitive topic. The problems of evil and pain, moral evil, the bad things people do to one another, and pain, natural evil, tsunamis, cancers, earthquakes. How do we make sense of them? And the difficulty is that there are 2 perspectives. One is the oncologist who's studying cancer. The other is the young woman who's just been told she's 3 months to live. And so we must deal with this with great sensitivity, how we're to face it, because, my friends at least, it's the #1 reason they give for not believing in God. Okay, there may be evidence of design in the universe, many of them say, and that's interesting, but don't talk to me about a personal God that cares, because obviously such a God does not exist. So try and follow me as I go briefly through what I might say. If they're looking at it from the intellectual side, I'd say, well, you've got rid of God then. You've solved the problem. And they look at me strangely, and yes, we've solved the problem. That's just the brute fact of how life is, and so on. Well, I'd say maybe, but you haven't got rid of the suffering, have you? It's still there. And in fact, it could be argued that you've made it 10,000 times worse, because you've certainly got rid of hope. Because if death is the end, in your view, then there is no hope. So I'm not sure you've solved a great deal. Now, of course, as a Christian, I have a problem in a way that you don't have it, but since we both have the problem, let me try to explain to you how I cope with it. And very often at this point they say, but look, you know, and I'm going to cut this very short, surely a good and all-powerful God who's benevolent could have made a world that these things don't go wrong. And I say, of course he could. We can make such a world. It's called a robotic world. Robots can't sin, they can't damage, or you know what I mean. God could have made us robots, but then there would have been no humans in that world. The people that say, couldn't God have made a world in which there's no possibility of sin and damage, are wishing themselves out of existence. because it wouldn't be a world in which any of us existed, because the supreme dignity of human beings is the fact that we are capable of love and therefore of hate. We've got an element of choice, and God has given us that enormous gift that we can either say yes to one another or no, and yes to him or no. And that makes possible all the richness of human life. So God took a risk in making us. But of course there are many parents here, you know all about this. You took a risk in having children, didn't you? I remember holding my first child in my hands and thinking, you could grow up to say no to me. Well, why have children then? Well, aren't you glad your parents are children? Think about it. You see, the risk is there and it's built in. We've got a very shallow view of the universe if we think that it's an easy thing to create beings outside yourself with real personality, whose decisions have real consequence, who are in fact, as Genesis claims, moral beings. That's a phenomenal dignity to be given, but it comes at a cost. It comes at a very big cost. Now, the reason we never get anywhere with the argument, a good God should, would, could, and we've all done it when students till midnight and again and again and again. Nobody's happy with that argument. I've never ever met a person in my entire life who's ever got anything out of that argument, for a very simple reason. That when it all boils down, the universe that sits in front of us presents us with a mixed picture. I call it beauty and barbed wire. Magnificence and bombs. I love looking at the Andromeda Galaxy through a telescope. I switch on the television and I see an ISIS murder. It's a mixed picture, ladies and gentlemen. No matter how we argue, it's a mixed picture. So, if we get nowhere along the line of questioning that I've just suggested, perhaps we've been asking the wrong question. And I think we have. I think there's another question we can ask. Granted, it's a mixed picture. Is there any evidence anywhere that there is a God whom we can trust with it? That's a huge question. I think there is. And this is where we come to the uniqueness of Christianity, because at its heart there lies two claims. One, that Jesus is God. And secondly, he died on a cross. Now, at the very least, try and follow me. At the very least, and I'm putting it very crudely, God on a cross raises a profound question. What's God doing there? Well, surely you can see, as I can see, that it tells me that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. That's a window through which you can go. Because you see, if that was the end of it, we'd never have heard any more about it. But Christianity goes on to tell us that Jesus rose from the dead, so death is not the end. And here's where the biggest problem comes in. Richard Dawkins once wrote, and he's never taken it back, I've asked him about it several times. This universe is just what you'd expect it to be. If there's no good, no evil, no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. In other words, well, what he's talking about, the problem of evil, if he doesn't believe there's evil, I don't know. But you see, that is a bleak, awful view of things in which there's no morality. And I said to him, it's bleak, Richard. He said, yes, it is, but that doesn't mean it's false. No, I said, but it doesn't mean it's true either. Now, we need to face this. Watching atheism to its logical end. And I said, you have no ultimate hope. You don't believe in justice. He said, of course I believe in justice. I work for justice in this world. I said, that's marvelous, so do I. But there's no ultimate justice. Now, what does that mean? It means that the multi-millions of people who have ever lived will never get justice. They've been cheated, abused, killed, murdered in this life. And there's no other life for justice to be done. So they will never get justice. So our conscience that cries for justice is an illusion. Now here's where the Christian answer doesn't compete with any other religion or philosophy, because none of them say anything like this. That the wonderful thing is that when Jesus rose from the dead, the apostles immediately had a message to preach that there would be a judgment. And that was a glorious thing to preach, because it said there is an arbiter against which conscience is measured. This is a moral universe, but of course it raises a very big question. What's going to happen to me in the judgment? God's going to be utterly fair. What will that mean for me? And then, of course, the magnificent genius of the whole thing appears. That the cross of Christ doesn't simply show that God has taken part in suffering. It shows that Christ has died for our sins. And therefore those two profound problems. As a human being, I need forgiveness. I need peace. How many people I meet as I get older and they say, I've no peace. That we can be offered all of that. That's why I'm a Christian, ladies and gentlemen. It's not an insult to other religions. None of them offer anything remotely like it. That you can know in this life that you've got peace and pardon, not because of your merit. And all other religions, by the way, are based on merit, including some versions, sadly, of Christianity. But it's the merit of Christ who died for me. But you see, it gives me an insight into the problem of suffering and evil at the same time as dealing with the evil that lives in my own heart. It is utterly unique, and that's why I believe that Jesus is the Son of God.
Dr. Mike Murray will now give our final words of closure. Thank you, Mike.
So thank you very much.